As night fell, the group noticed an eerie silence settling over the cemetery, far too quiet for a place so full of death. The wind stilled, and even the sounds of nature seemed to vanish. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The group continued through the graveyard, their flashlights flickering in the growing darkness. And that's when it happened. One of the adventurers, a young woman named Sarah, saw something in the distance, an apparition, barely visible in the dim light, a figure in white, standing motionless among the gravestones. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she stepped closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil, but her eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They were hollow, black, and filled with a deep, unrelenting sadness. Terrified, Sarah called out to her friends, but when they turned to look, the figure was gone. They assumed it was just a figment of her imagination and continued exploring. But something had changed. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sense of being watched became undeniable. It wasn't long before they began hearing strange noises, whispers carried by the wind, faint footsteps behind them, and the soft rustling of leaves in the absence of any breeze. As the group made their way deeper into the cemetery, they stumbled upon a crumbling mausoleum, its entrance partially obscured by ivy. The door creaked open with an eerie sound as they pushed it aside. Inside, the smell of decay hit them like a wall. The walls were lined with old, rotting coffins, some of which had been disturbed. But it wasn't the sight of the coffins that struck them with fear. It was what they saw on the walls. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved in blood that had long since dried to a dark brown. Among the symbols was a series of names of the town's original inhabitants, their graves marked by the same symbols. But there was one name, written in fresh blood, that stood out among the others. Sarah recognized it immediately. It was her own. Panic set in. The group tried to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Their flashlights flickered, and as they struggled to escape, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though something was moving underneath them. Then, in an instant, the tombstones began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light. The spirits that had been bound to this place for centuries were now awake. A shadow moved across the cemetery, and the group saw a figure approaching them, a man dressed in the tattered clothing of an ancient time. His face was pale, his eyes wide open but devoid of life. He reached out towards Sarah, his hand cold and lifeless, and whispered one chilling word: "Help." As the group bolted for the exit, they could hear the voices of the restless spirits rising from the graves, their whispers growing louder and more desperate. They had made the pact to protect the town, but in doing so, they had condemned themselves to eternal torment. The adventurers barely escaped with their lives, but they would never forget what they had witnessed in that cursed cemetery. And Sarah, she could never shake the feeling that something was following her, that the spirits of the cemetery were still calling to her, bound by the same dark force that had claimed them all those years ago. Tucked away in a quiet town, far from the bustling cities, lies a military cemetery that many people avoid. With rows upon rows of weathered graves, it looks like any other cemetery at first glance. But those who are familiar with its history know better. This cemetery holds secrets tied to the horrors of war and the chilling aftermath of a pact made by a soldier who never returned. The cemetery was established after the end of World War II, a place to honor the brave men and women who fought for their country. Yet this cemetery became notorious not for its tribute to fallen heroes, but for the eerie happenings that occurred in the years following its establishment. It was said that one soldier, Sergeant James Hawthorne, made a pact before going into battle. Desperate to secure victory in a crucial battle, James sought out dark forces to ensure his army would triumph. In exchange, his soul would be claimed, bound to the land forever, a sacrifice that would be paid once the war was over. James did not survive the war. His body was buried in the cemetery, his grave marked by a simple stone with no name, only a symbol of his pact. For years, the cemetery was peaceful, as though the weight of the past had settled into the earth. But then, strange occurrences began to take place. People walking through the cemetery would hear the sound of footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Some claimed to see a figure standing among the graves, wearing the uniform of a soldier, staring into the distance as though waiting for something or someone. Cemeteries have long been seen as peaceful resting places, where the dead are left in eternal slumber. We visit them to mourn, to reflect, or to simply pay our respects to those who have passed. But what if the reality of cemeteries is far darker than we've been led to believe? What if these places of silence hide secrets that are far more terrifying than we can imagine? Some say cemeteries are not merely grave sites, but are instead portals to another realm. A realm where the dead are not truly at rest, but instead linger in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return, to disturb the living, and to seek revenge on those who have forgotten them. This is the unspoken truth of many cemeteries, places that, after the sun sets, transform into something much more sinister. Some are said to be cursed, others haunted by dark rituals or supernatural forces that shouldn't exist. In today's video, we will delve into 3 true and terrifying stories about cemeteries, places that harbor more than just the remains of the dead. These are places where the living are forced to confront their darkest fears, as the boundary between life and death becomes frighteningly thin. These are stories of necromancy, dark pacts, and the disturbing reality that not all spirits rest in peace. By the end of this video, you'll start to question what really lies beneath the surface of every cemetery you've ever visited. Because the dead may not be as quiet as we think. Cemeteries, for most of us, are simply places where the dead are laid to rest. They are peaceful, somber spots where we can pay our respects to loved ones who have passed. But what if there's more to these locations than meets the eye? What if the ground beneath our feet holds secrets we are not meant to know? For centuries, cemeteries have been linked to mystery and fear. It is no coincidence that these places are often the setting for ghost stories, legends, and myths. In some cultures, there is a belief that cemeteries are not just the final resting place for human bodies, but that they also act as gateways between the living world and the supernatural. Dark rituals, necromancy, and pacts made with forces beyond our comprehension are said to take place in these locations, where the veil between life and death is disturbingly thin. The very idea that something can lurk beneath the surface, waiting to return, is what makes cemeteries so unsettling. Some people claim to have seen figures walking among the tombstones, heard whispers carried by the wind, or even felt an unseen presence as they wandered through the graves. What makes these stories even more chilling is that they are not just fiction. Many of them are based on real events, accounts, and experiences that have been passed down through generations. In the stories we will explore today, we'll uncover the dark history of these eerie locations. From haunted military cemeteries to cursed burial grounds, each tale will reveal how these places are far from the peaceful resting spots we imagine them to be. They are, in fact, active places of power, where the line between the living and the dead is not as clear-cut as we believe. In the heart of a forgotten land, nestled among overgrown woods and the ruins of an abandoned town, lies a cemetery unlike any other. Its headstones are cracked and weathered, as though the very earth beneath them is trying to push them back into the ground. The cemetery is a place few dare to visit, yet it has become infamous for the chilling stories that have haunted local legends for decades. The town, once thriving, was cursed long ago, its people condemned to a fate far worse than death. It was said that, in a desperate attempt to protect themselves from marauders, the townsfolk made a dark pact with a malevolent force. The pact promised safety in exchange for their souls after death. But as with all dark deals, the price was far steeper than they could have imagined. The souls of the townspeople would be trapped forever in the cemetery, neither able to rest nor leave, bound by the terms of their unholy bargain. The cemetery was constructed in the center of the town, its ancient stones marking the graves of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Over time, as the town fell into ruin, the cemetery was left to decay. The land grew wild and the last inhabitants left. But the Pact remained. The restless spirits of those buried there began to stir, unwilling to accept their fate, and it wasn't long before visitors began to disappear. One evening, a group of curious adventurers, eager to uncover the mysteries of the cursed cemetery, set out to explore the area. They had heard the rumors, of course, but they were skeptics, convinced that the stories were nothing more than folklore. With cameras in hand, they ventured into the heart of the cemetery, eager to uncover what lay beneath the thick mist that seemed to cling to the tombstones. The most terrifying stories came from those who visited the cemetery at night. They spoke of a man dressed in military garb who would appear near James Hawthorne's grave, his eyes hollow and his face drawn with a deep sadness. The man would never speak, but his presence was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. It was said that those who encountered him were never the same again. They would leave the cemetery with a sense of dread hanging over them, unable to shake the feeling that something was following them. One such story involves a young man named Ethan, a local who had grown up hearing the stories of the haunted cemetery. Ethan had always dismissed the tales as mere ghost stories, stories told to frighten children and thrill seekers. But when he lost a bet to his friends, they dared him to visit the cemetery at midnight, to prove that the tales were nothing more than superstition. Ethan accepted the challenge, eager to show that he wasn't afraid of the so-called ghost of the soldier. Armed with nothing but his flashlight and a sense of bravado, he made his way to the cemetery, determined to prove that the stories were just that, stories. As he walked through the gates, the air grew heavy, the silence pressing down on him. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of graves. Ethan felt a strange sense of unease, but he brushed it off, convincing himself that it was just his imagination running wild. He passed by grave after grave, each one seeming more lifeless than the last, until he reached the far corner of the cemetery. It was there that he saw him, the soldier. The figure was tall and thin, his uniform tattered and stained, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes, however, were the most terrifying aspect of his appearance. They were wide open, empty of any life or warmth, as though he was staring into an abyss that no one else could see. The soldier stood motionless, staring at nothing, but Ethan knew he had to be James Hawthorne. Suddenly, the air turned cold. Ethan's breath became visible in the night air, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The soldier began to move, slowly at first, his steps dragging as though he were bound by invisible chains. As he drew closer, Ethan could feel his heartbeat quicken. His body was frozen, unable to move, as though an unseen force was holding him in place. The soldier reached out a hand, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, said only one word: "Help." The voice was hollow, echoing as though it came from deep within the earth itself. Ethan, terrified beyond belief, finally broke free from his paralysis and ran. His legs carried him faster than he thought possible, but no matter how far he ran, he could still feel the cold presence of the soldier behind him, as if the figure was following him through the cemetery, lingering just out of sight. When he finally reached the gates and looked back, the soldier was gone, but the sense of dread remained. For weeks after that night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the soldier was watching him. He'd hear footsteps behind him, feel cold breath on his neck, and sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he would see the soldier's hollow eyes staring back at him. The stories of Sergeant James Hawthorne had been true. The Pact had bound him to the cemetery, and his soul was trapped there, unable to find peace. And though Ethan had escaped the cemetery that night, he wasn't sure that he had truly escaped at all. The soldier, it seemed, was still out there, waiting for the moment when someone else would finally help him fulfill his pact, if such a thing was even possible. In the depths of a dense forest, hidden far from civilization, lies an ancient tomb that no one dares to enter. The tomb, said to be the resting place of an infamous necromancer, is surrounded by rumors of forbidden rituals, cursed spells, and the restless spirits of the dead. The Necromancer, once a powerful and feared sorcerer, had vanished mysteriously centuries ago, leaving behind only whispers of his dark practices. According to local legend, the Necromancer, known only as Malakar, was a man consumed by an obsession with life after death. He sought to master the secrets of necromancy, the dark art of communicating with and raising the dead. But unlike others who dabbled in these dark arts, Malakar had a particular goal: to transcend death entirely, to find a way to bind his own soul to the physical world, allowing him to live forever and control the dead at will. Malakar's tomb was not constructed like a typical burial site. Rather than a simple grave, it was a grand and ominous structure, designed with intricate carvings, dark runes, and symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Inside, the tomb was filled with objects and artifacts related to Malakar's work: ancient texts, strange relics, and jars containing preserved body parts that he had used in his gruesome experiments. Over the years, many had ventured into the forest, drawn by curiosity or the promise of treasure, but none had returned. The tomb was said to be cursed, protected by the malevolent spirit of the necromancer himself. But despite the warnings, a group of thrill-seekers, eager to prove their bravery, decided to venture into the forest one fateful night. Led by a man named Michael, a self-proclaimed expert in the occult, the group trekked through the dense woods, their flashlights illuminating the path ahead. They had heard the stories, of course, the tales of Malakar's dark rituals and the ominous warnings from the locals, but they were determined to explore the tomb and uncover its secrets. When they reached the tomb, it was even more imposing than they had imagined. The stone entrance, covered in vines and moss, seemed to breathe with an eerie, almost sentient energy. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the sounds of the forest had grown silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Michael pushed open the massive stone door, and the group entered, the creaking sound of the door echoing through the stillness. Inside, the tomb was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of decay and dust. The walls were lined with shelves containing odd trinkets, bones, skulls, and strange talismans, and the floor was littered with old manuscripts, some torn, others burnt. But what caught their attention the most was the large stone sarcophagus in the center of the room. The intertwined tales of the necromancer Malakar's tomb and William Frost's forgotten grave paint a chilling tapestry of despair, curses, and eternal unrest. The cursed sarcophagus holds a power so dark and insidious that it consumes all who dare to approach, while Frost's grave whispers a cautionary tale of meddling with forces beyond human comprehension. These stories, passed down through hushed voices and fearful glances, remind us of the fragility of human will against the supernatural. Each location, whether the sealed tomb deep in the forest or the mist-covered cemetery, seems to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The necromancer's vengeance lingers in the shadows of his tomb, awaiting the next curious intruder, while the restless spirit tied to Frost's grave perpetuates a cycle of dread, ensnaring those who dare to dismiss its warning. These are not mere stories of ghosts or ghouls. They are testaments to the unending consequences of ambition and curiosity when they cross the line into the unknown. Both Michael's group and Emily serve as stark reminders of the price paid for disturbing the boundaries between the living and the dead. They illustrate the chilling truth that some secrets are better left buried, and some graves better left forgotten.